Hi everyone, I'm Hayley. I'm always in the craft room, and today I have two new linen tops to show you. This is one of them, and I have to tell you, I am so pleased with it. I wanted a cropped linen top to wear with some high-waisted trousers. I've seen them all over. They're across Sewing YouTube, the high street, a cropped square neck plain linen top, often in kind of oatmeal colours, dusky greens, taupe, beige. Those colours don't suit me, but plain white does. And I had a fabric in the stash. This is a linen from Jenny Stitches up in Barrow in Furness. And I actually bought this with a completely different pattern in mind. I was planning to make the Stay Stitch Patterns Malibu blouse. But the more I looked at this fabric, the more I thought it's too structured for that kind of drapey pattern. It's too stiff. It's just not a good mix of pattern and fabric. But I knew it would be perfect for a top like this. So, the pattern. I didn't want to buy a pattern, but I didn't have a pattern. So I went through my stash to find something I could work with, and I came across an Ottobre pattern called the Carmen top. Now, it was quite different from what I was envisioning, but it was also quite similar. And crucially, I had already traced this pattern out. So if you don't know, Ottobre is a sewing pattern magazine where in the back they have the pattern sheets, you fold them out, you find your pattern piece, and they are all printed on top of one another. You find your size and then you trace it out. And years ago, I had traced this pattern thinking it would make a cute shell top to wear to the office. However, I'd never got round to making it. What drew me to this pattern was the square neckline. I just thought it was gorgeous and exactly what I was looking for. There were other details that weren't quite so much what I was after, but you know, I love a challenge. At least I love a challenge more than I love tracing or downloading, printing, taping a new pattern. So in its original iteration, this pattern was almost exactly what I was looking for, except it was slightly too close fitting and it had fisheye darts. So I decided if I left the darts off, that would give me a little bit of extra ease. I did want an even boxier fit. So let me tell you what I did to the pattern. I decided to make a proper toile, which it's not really like me, but because I was altering the pattern, I thought it would be worth it. I have my pattern pieces here. Let me talk you through the changes that I made. So the original pattern that I traced off years ago was before I had really learned anything about fitting. And as soon as I looked at the pattern piece in its original iteration, I knew there were a couple of problems that I had to address immediately. The first one being this shoulder slope. So I laid this pattern piece onto my toile fabric, which was an old sheet. And the first thing I did was onto the fabric, draw out a square shoulder adjustment because these pattern pieces are without seam allowance. So I drew my neckline, and I normally do a 1.5 centimetre square shoulder adjustment. I decided to do 1 centimetre because I knew this wouldn't come out all the way to the shoulder point, it was in a bit. So I marked up 1 centimetre, I joined those, and then I raised the armhole 1 centimetre as well. And I did that drawing it straight on to the bed sheet. I also folded out 4 centimetres total, and then at the side seam, I added 1 centimetre all the way around for 4 centimetres total. And I didn't even draw in the fisheye dart because I knew I wanted a boxier fit. So I cut that out of the bed sheet and made a toile, and on the back piece I made the same square shoulder alteration, but otherwise left it as is. I'm gonna try on the toile and show you how that looked. So here is the original toile with those changes that I explained and without these fisheye darts. And I even sewed it up with side slits because I knew I wanted that. But there were a few changes I knew I needed to make straight away. So this front neckline, I loved the square shape. That was what I was after and I loved it. However, if I move this microphone, can you see that it's just a little bit baggy? There's just a tiny bit too much fabric there. So to rectify that, when I traced a new pattern piece, and I did make new pattern pieces, this fold line, I literally just shifted it so it was hanging off by 0.5 centimetre. And that just removed 0.5 centimetre down the whole centre front of the top. My usual disclaimer, I don't know what I'm doing. If you have better fitting advice for me, I would love to hear it, please and thank you. This is just what I did, not a tutorial. The other thing I noticed as soon as I tried this on was that the bust darts were way too high. They're just not pointing at my bust point. So I lowered those by 1.5 centimetres. There's also darts on the back of this, these little shoulder darts, and I just thought they were too pointy. They were just too short, too pointy, so I lengthened those by 1.5 centimetres as well. And I did that just by legs here to the point. I drew down the centre line out 1.5 more centimetres and rejoined those. I shortened the top by another 6 centimetres because I wanted quite a cropped finish. And the final alteration I made was to the straps. And it's not that obvious, but I do think it makes a difference. I took about 1 centimetre off the strap because before it was curving outwards and I wanted it to be straighter. I'm going to put the final top on again so that you can see the difference that all those changes made. So hopefully you can see that this neckline is now sitting completely flat against my chest. You can also see that the bust darts are much lower. Maybe I even need to lower them a bit more. Do let me know what you think in the comments. And I have shortened the top, and I also decided to do a kind of high-low hem effect, which that was easily done at the hemming stage. So the shoulders have been narrowed, a bust dart lowered, back darts made longer, and yeah, I love it. I'm pleased with the extra ease around the bottom. I really think this is just such a cute swingy length with the side slits. So let's talk construction. As I mentioned, this is a pattern without seam allowances. So that was actually a great advantage when I was trying on the toile because I could see the neckline and the armholes exactly as they would be when they were finished. Usually, if you cut a toile from a pattern that has seam allowances, you would then have to either clip into the neckline and press it or trim the seam allowances off or actually finish all the edges so you get a proper idea of where everything sits. So I actually preferred working with a pattern without seam allowances. When I came to make the top, I wasn't sure how I was going to finish the neckline and the armholes because in this linen, I wasn't sure whether or not it would be see-through. When I hold it up to the light, I can kind of see through it, but I just didn't know when it was a close-fitting garment whether it would need lining or whether I could bind the edges. You can see which route I went. Anyway, I laid the pattern pieces onto the linen and I drew in the square neckline and the armholes with an erasable pen, like a water-soluble, oh, there it is, a water-soluble pen. This is a Prim Aqua trick marker, and that meant that either if I decided to line it, I had a perfect blue stitching line to follow. If when I tried it on I decided it didn't need lining, I could trim that off really accurately, because with a square neck like this, when it's so front and centre, following a seam allowance isn't necessarily accurate enough for me when I'm stitching. A drawn in stitching line is better. So I assembled the top by overlocking all of the edges because this fabric does fray, and then I sewed the shoulder seams and the side seams, and because I'd already finished the edges, it meant I could press them open to do the split hem. Then I tried it on and I found that with a skin tone bra such as this one, it's not see-through at all. So I decided to go with a bias binding, and I just trimmed off those seam allowances exactly to the blue line. I made my own bias binding. I cut strips at about 35 millimeters and put them through an 18 millimeter bias tape maker. I actually love making bias tape. I find it so satisfying. And what I found with this fabric, it was quite wide, and I cut a front bodice, a back bodice, and then I had a little square left over. And I thought, if I can just cut that off and make binding from those strips, then I've got the rest of the fabric to make something else with. And I was like, will those strips give me enough length to bind neckline and armholes? So I measured around the neckline and the armhole with my tape measure, and I found that I was just short on the neckline. So I did have to piece the neckline piece of binding. One strip would do each of the armholes. So I got this top and the binding out of 52 centimeters of fabric. I know, I couldn't quite believe it. I was so pleased with myself. The binding method I used was to make the binding with my bias tape maker and then fold it in half, not quite equally. So I didn't fold it exactly in half. I did an overlap of about 1 millimeter, and then the shorter fold I applied to the wrong side of the garment, stitched that down, and that meant that when I wrapped it round to the front, I could top stitch from the front, knowing that the back was already sewn. I didn't have to worry about the binding underneath coming untucked and doing that annoying thing where a tiny bit doesn't get caught, it comes out and then it frays. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. I love doing binding this way, and then you just top stitch a little bit away from the fold, and I think the effect is so neat and so beautiful. Credit to Georgia from Georgia's Portfolio. I got this technique from her Mellow dress, and it's foolproof to me. It always looks immaculate, and everything is caught because you're top stitching from the front so you can see what you're doing. Has anyone seen this method of applying it anywhere else? Because I've had a lot of patterns that have bias binding in them. This is the only one where I've seen you sew it to the wrong side first, and I am never going back. For the hem, I just turned it once because this is quite a stiff fabric, and I thought a double turned hem might just make it too stiff and bulky. So it's already overlocked. I turned it once and stitched it, and I did top stitching all around in one, and I'm really thrilled with the top. But wait, there's more, because I had 1.5 meters of this fabric, and we've already established I only used 52 centimeters on this top. So I cut out not one, but 2 more tops. I'm only going to show you one more today because one still hasn't been made, but it wouldn't be the full story unless I showed you this. So here in my project bag, I have all cut out a République du Chiffon Dominique jumpsuit blouse. And by that I mean, I've taken the top of that jumpsuit and turned it into a sleeveless blouse. And it has a collar, it's fully faced. There really are quite a few bits and pieces, and I managed to get them all out of the remaining 98 centimeters of this linen. I was very pleased to get that cut out. It is quite an involved sew because you have to make the collar, all the facings, buttons. There's a lot to it. And once I'd finished cutting that out, I realised I still had a little bit left over. And so I cut out this. So this is the third top I cut out of my fabric, but the second one I made, and it is almost a pattern Scout Flora top. So I've made this pattern before and absolutely loved it. The original pattern has pleats all down the front. So let's talk about how I cut this out of my remaining remnant. So there are two things I particularly love about the pattern Scout Flora. One is the shaping around the top of the bodice. I just think this curve is so pretty and it hits me in exactly the right place. And I also love the bra-friendly straps. Now, usually this has a lot of pleats and the pattern piece is very wide and then curved at the edges. I didn't have enough to do the full pleats, obviously. So what I did was I drew in the arch and then I went the full width that I could, flipped the pattern piece over, drew in the other side, cut that out and tried it on basically. And I had obviously too much in the front, so I tried to do a few little pleats, a few little tucks here and there to see how it looked. And honestly, it didn't look good. It just looked like an accident. It looked like I'd cut it too big and then was trying to fix it. So what I did instead was I got my already existing pattern Scout Flora top. I measured between the two marks for the straps and then I onto the fabric, drew that mark in and then repositioned the pattern piece to match that notch and drew in the side and then I just made it flat basically. And I really like the effect. Now, of course, because you're supposed to have all these pleats, that's what gives the ease at the hips. So I have got these splits and they are genuinely necessary both to get this on and off and for wearing ease. So I don't know. I'm not mega in love with this top, but I also think it will be super useful for summer. Do let me know what you think. As I say, I cut it out of the smallest remnant that would otherwise have gone to waste anyway. So it was just kind of a fun challenge. The straps I did cut on the cross grain because that's what I had left. I don't think it actually makes a difference. And the straps, I didn't do quite how Casey suggests that you do them. She has you fold them in half, tucking in the raw edges, and that way you end up with one fold that is just single, and then on the other side you have 4 pieces of fabric, if that makes sense, because you folded in each of the sides. I thought in this slightly see-through linen that would mean that you had one side with a white shadow and one side without, and I didn't fancy that. So I cut them in half up the middle, ran both edges through the overlocker and then turned them. And because of a lack of fabric, these are narrower than the straps in the original pattern, but they still cover my bra, so I'm very happy with them. The back as well as the front has the pleats in the normal pattern, so I did exactly the same, just to cut the back flat. And for the edging, Casey does use bias binding, but not in the same way as with the other top. This top is a bias binding that is pressed in half and then applied and wrapped around. That's why I didn't need seam allowance for this top, because you literally apply the binding, sew it at 6mm, flip it over, and it just encases the seam allowance, which is still standing up that way. I love that finish and I think it looks great in the linen self fabric on this top. For this one, firstly, I didn't have enough of the linen, and secondly, the bias application is different. You use single fold bias tape where you apply it to the right side, then flip it all in and top stitch it down. So you can't actually see the binding on the outside at all. It's all flipped to the inside. I didn't have enough fabric to make any more binding, and also since you don't actually see it, I didn't think that it mattered whether it matched. And this linen is pretty hefty and stiff, so I knew I would be fine just using a different white fabric for a binding. I made up this top like on a whim. I was just like, oh, there's a little bit of fabric left. I wonder if I can get a faux Flora out of that. I made it up knowing I didn't have any fabric for the binding, and I thought I'll just see if it works, and if it does, then next time I'm at haberdashery, I will buy some white binding. I looked in the stash of fabric, didn't have any suitable white fabrics, and then I thought, just going to check the haberdashery stash, and what do you know? Left over from my Notches Odell blouse, I had a length of bias binding in white cotton that was not a lot, probably not enough for a whole project, like it wouldn't have done this, but it would do just around the top of this bodice, which was all I needed. It was just amazing. And that bias binding, which I bought from Abercorn in North Wales, is such beautiful quality. It's 100% cotton. It's so thin. It's so pliable. It's just beautiful. The only other bias binding I've worked with that's pre-bought is the Wrights stuff, which comes in a packet. And I've never had good luck with that. I've always found it so stiff that it just, you can see it from the outside of the garment. And I know you can see this through, but I mean, it just, it's like the bias binding is wearing the garment rather than the other way around, if that even makes sense. But I just find it too thick, too stiff. Whereas this cotton stuff, so beautiful, so pliable, and I really love the finish that this has given me on this top. So those are the two tops that I've completed. As I say, from the same 1.5 meters, I have a blouse cut out as well. So thanks so much for watching. Let me know which one is your favourite, the Ottobre top or the Flora. I hope to see you again very soon to see how my Dominique looks. Bye.